Welcome back to another episode with Michael Horner, and I'm your co-host Kirk Durston. And we have been looking at how Judeo-Christian values have made an enormous contribution to Western culture, despite the influential myth that's been running around that has been quite the opposite. Now, in the last episode, we began to look at something we called the fruit without the root, and that is, although Western society benefited greatly from the contribution of Judeo-Christian values, I don't think it recognized it as such, and it began to cut itself off from, say, belief in God, distance itself from Christianity, but yet wanted to retain the values, not realizing that the values were rooted in Judeo-Christianity and the teachings of Jesus Christ. So now we find ourselves in today's culture, where the culture doesn't seem to be going in a good direction anymore. And when we look at the values, they seem to have become kind of twisted. They don't really resemble maybe so much the teachings of Jesus Christ. And so we're going to take a closer look at that today. So Michael, welcome back. And what have you got to say about this?
Yeah, thanks for that intro. That was exactly what we talked about last week, the fruit without the root. The Enlightenment humanists liked the values, especially the idea of the equal value, worth, and dignity of every human being, and the human rights that flow from that. But there was a desire to not accept the root of those beliefs, so the fruit without the root. Now, in our series here that we're covering, I began with a slightly different question, which was, how did we get here? In other words, how did we get to the ideas that dominate our culture right now? Thinking that there's some of them that are pretty far out there and pretty strange, especially in contrast to Judeo-Christian values. And I wanted to know the history of it. And so what we've been talking about so far doesn't seem to answer that question directly. We've been talking about sort of history of the last 2,000 years of the impact of Christianity, and then getting up to the Enlightenment and what's been happening there. Today we're going to get a little bit closer to what's happened in the last couple of hundred years. But it's by going back further that we've seen that it's all connected. It's all connected to, I think, the influence of Jesus' teachings, and that's finally showing fruit in liberal Western culture. But in adopting those values, whether they realized they were Christian values or not, in adopting those values, Enlightenment humanists wanted to do it without the root, without belief in the supernatural and belief in God. And that has had an effect on how much good those values can do, how long they've lasted, how long they're hanging around now. And so the question we want to ask ourselves today is, how did these Christian values get twisted? And it's actually quite a complicated answer, even when you just look at the last 200 years. But the scholar Carl Trueman has done a very excellent analysis of this in his excellent book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and then a more popular level version entitled Strange New World, Carl Trueman. He's very helpful and on analysis of thinking, starting with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Romantic poets, Marx, Darwin, Nietzsche, Freud, and then moving more into the 20th century, cultural Marxism, postmodernism, and up to where we are now. And his analysis, I'm going to give a very brief outline of it, but it gives a broad picture of some of the influences that can help us. If our listeners are wondering, how did we get here, the way that I was wondering that, this will begin to start to answer that a bit more specifically. And so there's been two broad influences since these values rooted in Christianity began to manifest in a really positive way in Western culture. And the influences, in addition to to Christianity are Enlightenment humanism, which we focused on last week, who want the values without the root, the fruit without the root. And then the new kid on the block, which I kind of introduced last week, which is, for lack of a better term, and I don't mean it as a smear term, just wokeism, which is basically cultural Marxism plus postmodernism, plus critical theory and queer theory, kind of all lumped in together as a second broad influence. So, to begin this analysis of ideas more recent to our own time, I want to focus on one particular root at the beginning here, the root of the human condition. The Christian view of the human condition is that human beings are fallen. We're flawed. And this is what we discovered in our analysis of religious versus irreligious violence a few episodes ago. We discovered, as John Dixon, the historian, said, the real problem is neither religion nor irreligion. The problem is the human heart in possession of a misdirected passion. And so any ideology or worldview is capable of resorting to violence to promote its or defend its position, because it's human beings who hold these views, beliefs, and positions, and humans do seem to have a proclivity to self-centeredness and even violence. And this is what Christian teaching affirms, that humankind is fatally flawed, and it is a human problem, not a unique problem of religion or religious violence or Christianity. The problem is not religions, but the human race. And so I pointed out that Alexander Solzhenitsyn had it right when he stated, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil, he says, cuts through the heart of every human being. That's all of us. So what happens when that root of viewing the human condition as flawed, fallen, gets rejected? The root gets cut. People rebel against the idea of original sin and begin to think that no, humans are born innocent, and it's only institutions that make people bad after they've been born. And so the problem is not inside, but the problem is outside. And this is how Truman's analysis begins, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau reacted against this idea of original sin, total depravity, that there's nothing good in man. He responded by asserting that infants are born innocent, and it's society and institutions that make a human bad or evil. Now, it's important to note that Rousseau did believe in a universal human nature, but it's not flawed. It's not bad. And then Rousseau was followed by the Romantics, the Romantic poets like Wordsworth and Shelley and Blake. And they thought that nature possessed an intrinsic sacred order, especially human nature, on which an ethical life and flourishing could be built, if only the hypocritical institutions of civilized society could be stripped away, and any unhappiness that man experiences comes not from within, but from the society and institutions. And I mean, these thoughts were having a tremendous impact in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And so Rousseau and the Romantics, and I've always thought that's a great name for a doo-wop group. I like doo-wop music. So anyway, Rousseau and the Romantics placed a high premium on emotions for moral education. But their assumption was that there was a common human nature that could lead to agreement on what things should arouse appropriate empathy and sympathy, or anger and outrage. And so Rousseau sees empathy as having a universal stability because it's grounded in his confident assertion of the existence of a universal human nature that possesses a conscience that is the same for everyone. But you take away that notion of human nature, and all you're left with is kind of free floating subjective sentiments and feelings. And that's what happened. That was the next progression in the thinking, in the ideas. Truman points out that Marx and Nietzsche both rejected the idea of a transcendent, stable, moral nature to which humans must conform in order to flourish. And then throw in Darwin, who removes any sort of teleology, any sort of having the world and human beings being created with some purpose, with some design that they're supposed to follow and some purpose they're supposed to reach for. So once you remove God, morality then just becomes manipulation. Now, this is a challenge to Rousseau, right? Rousseau and the Romantics wanted to hang on to this human nature and the conscience that is there, and that can give us a basis so that we can all feel the same things about right and wrong, and then we can build a system. But once Marx, Nietzsche, and Darwin got involved, morality then just becomes, well, there is no human nature. So what is morality? For Marx, it was just manipulation by the powerful. It was used by the powerful to oppress those without power. And then Nietzsche saw it exactly the opposite way. It was manipulation, but it was by the weak. The weak were using morality to manipulate the powerful to make them feel guilty for using their power to get what they want. That is, make them feel like they are sinning and doing wrong. Because Nietzsche thought the powerful should dominate. So two opposite views by Marx and Nietzsche here, but both of them came from cutting the root out that human beings are fatally flawed and that there is a human nature, and that the conscience that humans have can put them in touch with something that is real, objectively true, in the moral realm.
I do have a question, Michael.
Yeah.
And maybe you're going to, and don't answer it if you're going to cover it shortly, but when they start blaming, then let's say our human condition on institutions and society, the first question that comes to mind is, well, what is it that produces an institution?
Yeah.
What are the things that make a society? What are those? And I have to say, human beings come out as the first candidate to form an institution or to form a society. So, and it just seems to be underscored when you look at, say, what's going on today when people say, well, we have a problem with institutional racism. So what's the solution? It's not to build a new building or to maybe move the location of the building to another geographical location. It's actually to start looking at the individuals within that institution and to attempt to re-educate them or to make them more sensitive to things that whoever's moving this or whoever's leading this wants them to believe or to change too. But they always seem to focus on, if there's an institutional problem, focusing on the individuals who comprise that institution. So it just seems to me to be just going around in a circle to say, and what is it about the individuals in the institution that causes it to go sour? And it's pretty hard to believe that we have a human nature. It almost seems they're talking about an alien force that's completely alien to humanity, that it sort of moves into an institution, that we had nothing to do, or we don't have a fallen human nature. We're innocent, and then this alien force moves in, but nobody actually believes that. So I don't know, like, isn't society an institution just another way of saying we have the collective behavior of a group of individuals or a group of human beings?
Yeah, you're asking great questions that would push us to dive deep into Marxism and the thinking here. But I think your insight is correct. If institutions are the cause of the problem for the individual, but institutions are made up of the individual, don't you have kind of a circular thing going on
Yeah.
here? And yeah, I think you're onto something there. It would probably take us too far afield to analyze Marxism any more than that. But that's a good insight. I do want to focus on what happens when we chop a certain root out. What implications does that have for particular values? So we've looked at chopping the root of the idea of human fallenness, and even, I guess, with that, the idea that there's a human nature. It's human nature that is fallen, and it's a nature that everyone has. And we mentioned sort of a second root here, teleology. So once you remove God from the picture, well, then the world hasn't been designed, and human beings haven't been designed, and we haven't been created for any purpose. In fact, the universe isn't here for any purpose. Teleology is gone, and you've got no ultimate purpose or design in life. And so, how does that affect values? Well, I think it affects the value of what we understand freedom to be. Freedom then changes from free to be what you were meant to be, according to your design and according for the purpose for which you were created, and to whatever I feel or desire to be or do. Now that's a radical change, and just by removing teleology, it's not freedom to be what you ought to be. It's just freedom to be whatever I feel I want to be or do. So freedom, therefore, actually becomes license by untethering it from God and from any just law that is rooted in God in any way, and rooted in teleology, in the sense that he created us with a purpose and with a design, and therefore it separates us from what I ought to be and what I ought to do. So that's another root that once you cut it, it produces big changes in values. And we're going to see that freedom comes up more than once here. It gets affected by a number of different roots when they're changed.
We might even want to, or maybe you will, what do we mean by freedom? Because there's freedom, one can have the illusion of freedom. On the other hand, let's say one wants to fly and dives off the top of a very tall building, and for a while you would have the illusion of freedom as you flap your arms.
Yeah.
And sooner or later reality looms, and then you find out the freedom you thought was freedom was actually a mistake. Or you might say a house we'd be more free if we didn't anchor it to the foundation. Then it would be free to maybe move around a bit or something. But maybe
And
the foundation is essential to the flourishing of the house.
right. And you've brought up a number of times your illustration of a guardrail, right? There's a guardrail that's stopping you from falling off the cliff. Well, I don't like that guardrail, and so I've got my own. And you carry a guardrail with you while you're walking along the edge of a cliff,
Exactly.
because now I'm free. But actually, you're not as free as you thought you were. That guardrail that was originally there was helping you be free to be able to hike that mountain. But carrying your own guardrail to give you more freedom has the opposite effect, because you're not going to be very free once you're flying down the mountainside.
Yeah, there's other things that an anchored guard rail gives you freedom from. That is hurtling down the cliff. It gives you freedom from that, from enormous physical harm or death. But you trade that for, you have freedom from that if the guardrail is anchored into the rock, but then you accept another kind of well, I'm just not sure how to clarify that, but sometimes one restraint will actually protect you from something worse.
Well, we're going to see examples of this as we move into Freud. So Freud, picking up on what came from Marx and Nietzsche and Darwin, he also abandons the idea that human nature has an intrinsic moral structure, and basically human nature just and morality reduces happiness to pain and pleasure. That's all it is. You experience pain or experience pleasure, and so humans should live to experience the greatest pleasure. And where's the greatest pleasure found? In Freud's view, in genital sex. So sex now is the foundation to human happiness. And human beings are actually defined by their sexual desires. So to abstain from sex in today's world, after the influence of Freud, is to sacrifice your true selfhood as the world around us understands it. It's to pay the price of not being able to be who one really is, allegedly. And that is therefore costly from Freud's perspective. But it's only from a perspective unshaped by or shaped by an uncritical and unreflective acceptance of Freud's categories of sexualized identity. And this is an example of where what Freud thought was going to produce freedom and greater happiness, there's evidence certainly beginning to show now that it has not done that.
It's almost depressing to think about that. It seems to reduce humanity to the level of an animal, like a dog in heat goes walking by, and we all know what happens if a dog in heat goes walking by a male dog. But it also assumes that there's no long-term consequences for behaving like that. And we're now seeing there are enormous long-term consequences. In fact, I just had a blood test done this week, and the nurse, because as a man, you want to get tested for, you have a PSA test for prostate cancer if that looms its head. But she said, yeah, it's for men, it's prostate cancer. For women, it's HPV, the human papillomavirus. But the human papillomavirus has just exploded since the sexual revolution. And so we see, yeah, we're free to engage, or more free to engage in genital sex, but there is an enormous amount of pain and suffering that we never saw coming that has happened as a result.
Exactly. We're going to revisit the issue of sexual morality in a few minutes here. This idea of the root of a human nature, that there is a human nature, and it's the essence. It's what makes us human. That's why we call it a human nature. The existence of that is one of the roots that we're going to look at now, and we've already sort of talked about it a bit. But it wasn't just Marx and Nietzsche and Freud who cut this root, but also existentialist philosophers. Existentialism cuts that root completely, with the view that my existence precedes my essence. I mean, the way the existentialists wrote this, it's all actually quite difficult to follow and understand. But it's basically saying you aren't born with an essence. You're just born. You just exist. That's what comes first. You exist. And so there's no essence that is there prior, that or even simultaneously with
You
your
might be
existence.
talking about what, the soul, or Plato's idea of the psyche? Is that what you're talking about? That internal aspect about yourself that defines you?
Well, that would be going into more explanation of what human nature is, and that sort of thing. But yes, for those that believe in the soul, it could be the soul. But even people that don't believe in a soul still might believe that there's an essence to what makes a human human, and we call that human nature. And it either is or isn't good or bad, you know. But existentialism just cuts that root and says, no, my existence precedes my essence. Therefore, I freely choose what I am and what I do. That precedes any concept of a human nature. Just my existence, and therefore I freely choose. And frankly, that was just the natural progression of this line of thinking. Once you got rid of God and teleology and human nature are eliminated, existentialism just put it into academic, profound sounding words.
Yeah. And of course, I then begin to wonder what they mean by freely choose. Because strictly speaking, if you grant their basic premise that we're just a collection of molecules, physical molecules, completely controlled by the laws of physics, initial conditions of the universe, choice is an illusion. You don't freely choose what you're going to be. You're just a victim of the internal genetics, the external chemical processes, and the laws of physics. And however you behave is simply a natural outcome, like one pile of rocks differs slightly from that pile of rocks over there. And freely choose, that's, I think they would need to think about that more carefully. But that's probably, again,
Well,
opens up another rabbit trail.
oh, that's a whole big debate, you know, whether free will exists or not. And
Exactly.
if it doesn't, if you follow your atheism to its logical end, it would seem like it doesn't. So then you redefine what you mean by freedom, and freedom then just means doing what you desire. If you do what you want, then you're free, even if what you want is determined.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, and that's called compatibilism, but that's a whole other uh, discussion.
In general, as you're going through these different theories, I really do wonder how much association these people had with the animal world. Like, for example, I grew up on a beef farm, and cows, they just don't all nicely get along together. They have a pecking order that's established by intimidation and strength. Same with dogs. And you look throughout even the higher animal world, and it would be hard to say that cows, for example, are naturally innocent and would get along just perfect together. No, they establish their pecking order by intimidation and strength. And this is the norm in the animal world. So when they come up with this idea that we're basically all just innocent and victims of our environment or so forth, and if we could just solve the problem of institutions, everything would be fine. But that seems to deny that there's some sort of an animal basic urges within humanity that maybe aren't always nice and self-sacrificing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not very knowledgeable of the animal kingdom. That's just not my area, but that certainly seems to be my observation even as well. So we move to another route here. So sort of chronologically, this is beginning to happen. That now another route starts to be attacked more, and it's the root of knowledge of any universal truths. So I mentioned that there's two broad influences: secular humanism or Enlightenment humanism on the one hand, and then there's a new kid on the block. Well, so secular humanism wants to affirm and still hold on to the fruit that makes Christianity possible, because they're humanists. They care about human beings. They want human beings to flourish. That's what humanism is about. But they don't want the epistemological and moral roots that make it possible. And so then postmodernism comes along and denies that such knowledge of any universal truth is even possible, and recognizes that, like Nietzsche said, apart from the existence of God, all that you've got left is power, the oppressors and the oppressed. You don't have the values anymore. So the secular humanist view, who wanted the fruit without the root, is being challenged because of the things that they're holding on to that allows them to keep the fruit in their mind. The postmodernist, the woke thinker just cuts it right out from underneath them by saying, well, even if there is such truth, it's impossible to really know it. And so you can't claim that there is any universal truth that is possible. Not just universal nature, but no one can know the truth of any kind, including scientific truth. The more radical postmodernists did. So, according to John Stonestreet and Maria Baer of the Colson Center, they say the secular humanism of the 20th century has been in steep decline for decades now, overwhelmed by a worldview. And it's the worldview that I'm referring to here. That is a mix of cultural Marxism, postmodernism, wokeness, critical theory, and so on, that holds that there is no universal, discernible story of reality that can be known, that we're all trapped in our own people groups and in our own understanding of reality that is defined by some sort of inner sense of knowledge. So they say, in such a context, if you read the Amsterdam Statement, which is the statement of the secular humanists, and they revise it every few decades, they say their statement seems almost quaint, like watching an episode of Little House on the Prairie or some other show committed to showing human goodness in a time gone by. Complete sections of the statement are written as if the 20th century never happened. And here's a quote from the secular humanist Amsterdam Statement, or declaration of their beliefs. We are convinced that the solutions to the world's problems lie in human reason and action. We advocate the application of science and free inquiry to these problems, remembering that while science provides the means, human values must define the ends. We seek to use science and technology to enhance human well-being, and never callously or destructively. But the authors are saying, if you look back in the 20th century, that's not really how it's turned out. And then other sections claim that all that God brings to the world, while rejecting God himself. So here's a wonderful paragraph from the Amsterdam Declaration. We value all sources of individual joy and fulfillment that harm no other. And we believe that ethical living is a lifelong undertaking. We therefore treasure artistic creativity and imagination, and recognize the transforming power of literature, music, and the visual and performing arts. We cherish the beauty of the natural world and its potential to bring wonder, awe, and tranquility. We esteem the quest for knowledge and the humility, wisdom, and insight it bestows. Wow. I mean, those are wonderful sounding aspirations. But without the root of the existence of God and teleology, there's no good reason to believe in the ontological existence of all those wonderful things.
Yeah, exactly.
Just our epistemological intuitions, and that these values are good and real, even if we can't successfully ground them in anything once God is removed. They are just our intuitions without the grounding. And so they add, one wonders what Nietzsche's madman would have to say to this. From its very beginning, secular humanism has, in various ways, promised to save the world. Not only have these promises failed, but no coherent vision has ever been offered for what a saved world would look like. Like the progressives of today, who promise progress without any fixed definition of better or worse, all that's left is a pursuit of pleasure to enshrine self-expression as the highest good. In other words, it was the abject failure of secular humanism that gave birth to the cynical postmodern ethos of today. And that is wokeism. And so, along comes the new kid on the block that reacts to secular humanism that is trying to have the fruit without the root, and said, you got way more problems that you haven't thought of. the fruit that you think is real, you don't really have access to. And then they end up proposing something even more radical. So with secular humanism, you have the fruit without the root. Same with Marxism, you have the fruit without the root. Interestingly, fascism is a little bit different. They also reject the fruit, the root, but they also reject the fruit. The fascists, like Nietzsche, they follow Nietzsche's view and say, no, the Christian fruit is not what we need. And then you got wokeism / postmodernism says, well, there's no way of knowing the fruit, or excuse me, there's no way of knowing the root. So the fruit is only socially constructed. But our socially constructed fruit is absolute and you must comply. And then lastly, Christianity is the only one that says the fruit is good, but can only be maintained by the root. So before we move on into maybe a little deeper discussion of flawed human nature, what do you think about that so far?
Well, it almost seems the word insanity came to mind, but I didn't mean it as a pejorative way. I think insanity could be defined as when you start believing things or when you start thinking along a certain way that's completely detached from reality. So in this case, what our culture has slowly done, first of all, it severed itself from the root, but it still continued to enjoy some of the fruit for a while. But then it began to take these various tracks you've just described, and wokeism seems to be the ultimate end result, where there is, as far as they're concerned, there is no reality to conform your behavior to, other than, well, it's not even, other than, let's say, social institutions or social constructs. But there it seems to be incredibly subjective. And the social construct might vary from person to person and from society to society. And then I suppose you get into a discussion of whose social construct the others. And as soon as you start worrying about which social construct is better than the others, you then have to start measuring it in some way. But what are you going to measure it by? I mean,
Right.
if you denied that there are any objective moral realities out there, it's one person's ruler, homemade, custom designed ruler versus another person's ruler that's drawn up on a piece of elastic or on a piece of twigs floating on water. So, and it's not just funny. I mean, it is kind of funny when you think about it, but it's the thing I've always thought of is that you can deny reality, and almost it seems to me that wokeism is a form of denialism, and it's a denialism of actual reality out there and anything that might control.
Yes.
But the problem with denying reality, and you can, no, it's probably best not to perform this experiment, but let's say you don't believe in city transit buses or traffic or cars or whatever, and you want to cross the street. Now you can not believe in speeding cars and transit buses, but when you cross the street, sometimes reality will collide with your own world that you have convinced yourself is your truth. And so the disaster of colliding with reality is a very real possibility at this stage under wokeism. It's a complete unhinging from reality, and therefore the collision with reality is inevitable, and it could be disastrous.
Yes, exactly. So when you try to have the values without the moorings, that is the fruit without the root, things get twisted. The fruit shrivels, twists into something else that no longer has the beneficial features that the fruit had. And so the simplest explanation for values being twisted is a flawed human nature. It explains immoral behavior of everyone, including believers and humanists who want to maintain the Christian values without the Christian roots. With a Christian, there's at least the potential for allowing the Holy Spirit to provide the power and even the conviction to live rightly. With unbelievers, the Holy Spirit is not manifest in the same way as the Holy Spirit is manifest in Christians. And so it should not be surprising that there would be a more consistent inability to follow the moral principles one holds to, let alone continue to hold the same moral principles consistently over a long period of time, compared to an authentic Christian, which may be different than just someone who's a Christian in name only. Because by authentic Christian, I mean someone who's consistently surrendered to and relying upon the internal power of the Holy Spirit that comes from God. And so we should actually expect difficulty for any individual or group to be perfectly consistent in holding to and living up to correct moral standards. Now, Christianity supplies a solution to that, but only if Christians live it out day by day will they actually find freedom to overcome their flawed human nature. So the good that resulted from Christian values becoming more influential and dominant in a culture will always be in danger of being watered down over time. And that's what's been happening from the beginning here. But even more so, once the roots of these values are explicitly and progressively rejected, like they have been since the Enlightenment. Of course, it gets even worse when the values themselves are explicitly rejected, as in fascism. But there will be varying degrees of living up to the values among believers as well, based on how consistent they are in trusting and obeying God's commands and surrendering to and appropriating the power of the Holy Spirit in their lives. And this seems to be where historically where revivals have actually made a significant difference in the lives of believers and then the culture in which those believers live. And so the 18th century revivals in America produced a culture that could actually accept the American Declaration of Independence, which said these values are self-evident. Because they certainly hadn't been self-evident to the rest of human history. And yet they were accepted as self-evident. Christianity had become the air they breathed, I think largely because of the revivals that took place in the 18th century. Now, claiming that these values are self-evident actually then becomes an experiment of what happens when you believe in the teachings of Jesus. And the results are Western civilization as we've seen it, and all the positive impact that has come with that. Not perfect, but this should be seen as evidence then for the truth behind the values of Jesus, the Jesus Revolution. That is, the fact that the American founders thought these values were self-evident is evidence for the success of Christianity in that culture prior to that, in teaching these values, of course. And it might also be that making these values the foundation of a culture, as they did, by recognizing them as self-evident, then helps influence and produce more positive impact, thus verifying the values. And I think that is kind of what has happened in the West, but only to a small degree. But even that small degree was enough for people to say there's something special going on in Western culture. And people nowadays saying, this special stuff that we like about Western culture, it looks like it's disappearing. And so I think people are recognizing there's something real there. That means, therefore, that systems of checks and balances to power would not only be wise for any governing arrangement, given this fatal flaw present within human beings, but it would be necessary. And that's one thing that the Americans got right. They built in significant checks and balances to their system that hadn't been part of other systems. And even in Canada, we try to build the same thing under a parliamentary system, with a monarchy behind it still. There was much more of an effort to acknowledge this fatal flaw. But that root was being chopped at consistently, even at that same time. and that's had a result. So this is something that many people recognize it as a discerning feature and efficacious feature of the American founders' framework, although it was apparently a minority position among most Enlightenment thinkers that human beings had a nature and it was flawed. But it was the remnants of the Christian teaching. And Rousseau's claim that humans are born in a state of innocence carried the day and not only undermined the need for built-in checks and balances in power structures, but over time led to the hegemony of expressive individualism, which is the phrase that Carl Trueman has used in his analysis to describe our current culture. The pendulum has swung so far away from original sin and the inherent flaw within each person to the measure of whether a person is good, healthy, and authentic is now how true they are to their own heart, meaning their own feelings, their own desires. Now, how far has this moved away from Jesus's teaching that what, quote, what comes out of a person is what defiles them, for it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. Jesus says all these evils come from inside and defile a person. So the Enlightenment Project has, for the most part, rejected this perceptive and profound truth, since it is considered a significant part of the roots of Christian values. And my view on this is it's the person who recognizes what is plain to all of us and acknowledges the ubiquitous flaw in human nature who is truly enlightened, far more than the Enlightenment thinkers were. And G.K. Chesterton summed it up well. He says, original sin is the only doctrine that's been empirically validated by 2,000 years of human history.
There you go. And it's hard to deny that, but you said something that is actually terrifying when you described where we've gone. And it was this idea that a person is, the measure of whether a person is good, healthy, and authentic is now how true they are to their own heart. Now let's just think about that for a second. What if that heart is flawed? What if there is a flaw in human nature? So now you've not only unhinged yourself from the root or severed yourself, but you've now attached yourself to the very source of evil that was described earlier by, say, Solzhenitsyn, where you're doing what your heart tells you to do, but the heart is fatally flawed, and the line between good and evil runs right through there. And this could usher in the most terrifying, the most morally bankrupt period of culture, when they embrace the human nature as innocent, when in fact it can be quite lethal in certain areas.
This is where modern progressivism can be clearly seen as being the opposite. It's regression back to the way of ancient times and the barbarism that was there prior to the influence of Christian values. So we're looking at this idea that rejection of the root tends to destroy fruit or twist the fruit into something different, misshapen. And another maxim of G.K. Chesterton, for those that don't know, he's a very insightful thinker from 120 years ago, roughly, and a Catholic thinker and a journalist and writer. And he said, the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. Now, that's over 100 years ago. He said that. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. That's our thesis in this episode.
Yeah. Words would fail him today if he saw what was going on today. He simply would.
That's true.
It seems to be a regression to just animalistic behavior. If in fact there is a primal aspect to ourselves, which we might say is similar to that old nature, that flawed human nature, a primal aspect. It's just surrendering oneself to the primal nature of intimidation, of getting what you want by causing a problem, so to speak. And I noticed that, let's say, protests today, you look at the woke, or people who have just, and being woke started off as maybe a good thing, but it rapidly degenerated. But it's how do they push forward or present or persuade of their own notions? It's not a lot of times through the normal, traditional, established processes of good arguments and so forth. Rather, it's often
Right.
just degenerates to a campus protest, which might spread elsewhere. But it just seems, let's cause a problem is the strategy, and the let's cause a problem as a strategy is exactly what animals do when they are disgruntled or they don't have their own way, they don't see their own way taking place.
You're exactly right. And just a couple of points down here, we're going to look at that one, the whole use of force rather than persuasion and
Hmm.
allowing people, free choice. But because I think you're exactly right, that is where we're headed. So let's look at a few more examples of twisted fruit to kind of uh, round things out here. And I think our listeners and viewers could probably come up with better examples of how they see how a fruit has got got twisted. But this is just the ones that I've identified, and I'll mention them. The twisted fruit of do no harm. Now, do no harm was around even before Christian influence, part of the Hippocratic Oath, which predates Christianity. And it was a good thing. I mean, it wasn't that there was no wisdom outside of Christianity. Um, but I think that much of the values and morals of the sexual revolution and critical race theory involve picking one of the relevant values to a situation and ignoring what has ironically been emphasized in the last number of decades, and that is the harm that it might cause to someone else. See, do no harm was the key moral premise of the Enlightenment humanism. Um, some thinkers called it the minimalist morality or minimalist ethics. That at the very least, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone else. I mean, that's what I was brought up in. Our culture taught me that. Do whatever you want. There's the freedom, as long as you don't harm anyone else. But what I'm beginning to see is, uh, do not harm anyone else. They're fudging on that now. So the secular humanist manifestos and declarations over the years emphasized do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone else. So, for example, like I remember 30 years ago, it was just roughly 30 years ago in Canada and in the rest of Western, well, in North America anyway, smoking was significantly curtailed in our culture. And it kind of came out of the blue. I mean, people had tried to curtail it in the past, but without much progress with it. It was just kind of viewed as being a moralist. That's just religious moralizing, trying to get people to stop smoking, back off. But 30 years ago, within a few years, it just happened. Why? Because the culture emphasized both the harm to the individual smoker as well as the secondhand smoke to those who have to breathe it in. And that was the key to making it happen. In Canada, I know there's a Christian member of Parliament, Jake Epp, that was a major influence behind all that. And I was just surprised at that. But that now time has changed. Now the emphasis seems to be on personal autonomy and either ignoring, denying, distorting, or discrediting any claims to harm others in the more current issues that we're facing. So, for example, um, the idea that bodily harm from homosexual sexual behavior is just ignored and denied, even though that is being um, claimed as being a harm and a reason to reconsider um, the morality of homosexual sexual behavior. Harm to children from same sex parenting. It's denied no matter what the research shows. the research is attacked and challenged. And even, I think, activist research is done without integrity to counter it. No one is allowed to kind of say there's harm to children here. But wait a minute, weren't we? That's not what we were all about. Do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm someone else. And now we're just, no, don't talk about harming someone else here. Or, I mean, the current elephant in the room these days is harm to children from transgender hormone treatments and radical surgeries. Um, no, don't talk about harm, but enough people are pushing through that now, because it's not just religious people who are seeing the problem. Our good friends, the secular humanists, are seeing the problems now and are speaking up, which is really interesting, because the radical left is using the same type of coercion to spread their views that the secular humanists used against religious people's views. But that's another whole topic.
Just on your note there about papers published in peer-reviewed journals to promote things that intuitively seem to be off. You may be familiar with the Cass report just published recently in the UK.
Right.
And I was just going over some of the aspects of it just this past week. And one of the things they noted is that with regard to transgender promotion and teaching and so forth, none of the papers that had been published on this issue were quality except for one. They could only find one paper that was what they would define as a quality paper. All the other papers suffer from serious issues with regard to sampling, statistical analysis, small sampling size, but yet the motive behind a lot of the papers nowadays is what the journal Nature might call perverse incentives. It's political pressure, activist pressure, pressure for funding, for advancement. And in this case, the perverse incentives result in a lot of papers being published to support, let's say, different aspects of wokeism, when in fact, when you examine the papers, there is a major issue here, and some journals are beginning to point this out. Some of the upper tier journals are beginning to point this out. So we can't just look at, say, peer-reviewed papers and say, oh, this paper shows this or that. The wokeism has infiltrated into the academic level.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're exactly right. And that's serious. That's serious. So this idea of do no harm, some other examples of where it's kind of being pushed to the side, denying that the humanity and personhood of the preborn human is there to avoid the charge that harm is being done to another human being. So in abortion, just deny that there's a human being there so that we avoid the idea of no harm. Euthanasia, same thing, denying that opening up the right to die for those who claim to want to die will not be harmful to others who do not want to die, and would produce a feeling of obligation in them to die. As much has been written about this, and I think in Canada we're seeing that is a problem already. The slippery slope is real.
And steeper than we thought.
Deeper and very slippery, yes. And not to mention the harm to those who are asking to die by affirming their view that their life is not worth living and they're better off dead, when their view might be only temporary if we provide proper loving care and affirmation and help, rather than cut all the funding to palliative care and replace it with help at dying. So it seems to me, my point is this, that the root of do no harm, which is actually a major part of the secular humanist view, now seems to be pushed to the side, ignored, denied, distorted, discredited, so that some other preferred value takes precedent, like my bodily rights or my autonomy to create my own reality. Another twisted fruit. This is a long episode, but I'm going to try to finish off the examples of twisted fruit here before we move on. So the twisted fruit of control over sexual passions. this is something that Christianity brought to the world, and was a good that they brought to the ancient world, that it was good to maintain control over our sexual urges and appetites and not become slaves to them. While this now got twisted, especially under Freud, into a word called repression. If you are having control or desiring control, you're repressive. It's repression, and that's a pejorative term that turns freedom from slavery into slavery to our sexual passions, urges, and appetites. In other words, it's good to be a slave to your sexual passions, urges, and appetites, because that's ultimately who you are. And so Christianity's view on sexuality is part of the values that actually helped build the Western world. It was and still is a positive view of sex that promotes human flourishing far better than the ancient world. Because in the ancient world, a free male could have sex whenever he wanted and with whomever he wanted, who was not a free male. And thus, and also far better than the current culture that's the result of the sexual revolution, where the only requirement is consent. And consent is a necessary requirement to a healthy sexual ethic, but it's not a sufficient one to promote human flourishing over time. So the early Christians were countercultural in the first century, and it's time to be countercultural again on this issue. Sexuality must have constraints in order to be good for human flourishing, both individually and collectively. Sex only within marriage, traditionally defined, is that constraint that the Christians brought. And the church in the first century essentially reached down and grabbed a man by the testicles and put restraints on the ancient worldview that men could satisfy their sexual urges anytime, anywhere, with people they view as their inferiors, which was basically everyone else. So another area that a lot of people are aware of, this one, the twisted fruit of classical tolerance. Tolerance is a very positive feature of liberal Western culture that many people have identified. But when you look at it and what it was based on the idea of disagreement. In other words, that when there's disagreement, how should we respond? We should respond with civil attitude, respect, and toleration, even if not agreement. Now that's so strange, because nowadays tolerance actually means you can't disagree. To disagree is to be intolerant. In fact, to disagree is hateful. And what needs to happen to you who are disagreeing and who are hateful is we need to use force, bullying, canceling, litigating, and violence to change you. I mean, that's a complete reversal of a value, one that was based on disagreement to one that says, no, disagreeing itself is the problem. And so how this is so twisted is the response to disagreement was twisted into imposing beliefs on others by claiming that their hate and discrimination, that what it is hate and discrimination, when it's really just nothing more than disagreement. So don't be tolerant of the intolerant. That phrase just becomes a justification for being intolerant of anyone who disagrees with you. And now that this wonderful value of tolerance has been completely twisted into the justification for your own hate for someone else. Disagreement becoming hate. Disagreement with somebody, even when done strongly, is not hate. It's not even a phobia. It's not even a discrimination. The scriptures teach that homosexual behavior is morally wrong, but it doesn't teach hate or a phobia of homosexuals. The church's response to the fact that the church disagrees with homosexual behavior is to say that the church the culture's response to the fact that the church disagrees with homosexual behavior is to say the church is wrong, phobic, and hateful toward homosexuals. And then the culture goes further and does the very thing they accuse believers in the scriptures of doing. They start to display genuine hate and phobia towards these alleged hateful people who are just disagreeing with them. That's all. And then that justifies their canceling them, bullying them, mocking them, censoring them, demonizing them, and coercing them to agree with their view through judicial changes and legal enforcement. And not just religious people who also would hold a, say, conservative view on sexual morality on a for secular reasons, like it's harmful to human flourishing, both collectively and individually, and it's contrary to the way human beings are designed. So if Christians really do display hate and have a phobia towards homosexuals such that it genuinely does discriminate against them, then that is wrong, and it should be condemned and stopped. But merely disagreeing with a view of sexuality that hardly anyone has held up until 10 to 15 years ago is not hateful or unloving, and one can be genuinely loving without necessarily agreeing with the person that they are loving. In fact, the most loving thing you can do to someone is to tell them the truth in a gracious way.
Yeah, no, this isn't just you saying this, Michael. You're not just coming up with this off the top of your head. It's actually a teachings of Jesus Christ that you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And his definition of neighbor pretty much he uses an example. For example, he used the Samaritans when he was talking to Jewish people because the Jewish people hated the Samaritans. But basically, if they're a human being and they're alive, well, even maybe if they're not alive, you're still not allowed to hate anybody. But as you point out, if a person is embarking on behavior or a practice or a belief that's destructive, then the most loving thing you can do is to somehow try and persuade them or make them question the path that they're going on. But something else that occurred to me as you were going through this is tolerance has now become basically, if you disagree with somebody, with what, let's say, the current cultural wokest position is, you are labeled as a hate monger, and then a lot of serious consequences can come. But what I thought of is, if you thought the Spanish Inquisition was bad, we are now heading into something that is practiced by more than just, well, it's almost out of control in certain areas, that the end result of thought policing, idea policing, is again quite disturbing. In other words, you said we should compare the blemishes of Christianity, and we looked at some of the blemishes, with something else, and we did compare it to atheistic cultures and regimes, but now there is arising a new thing to compare it with, and you've started to do that here, and that is to compare it to the end result of this whole progression you've described that winds up in what we're calling wokeism.
Yeah. Well, I've just realized that I've got too much here to try to squeeze more into this session. We're already about an hour and 9 minutes. So next time we will continue with a few more examples of twisted fruit. And I actually just thought of another one that I had thought of before and I hadn't included, and that's the twisting of the golden rule. The golden rule has become twisted. So we'll pick up on that and then move on to the question of, well, what do we do? And that's a question for both believers and unbelievers, especially people who care about human flourishing. What should we do about this? And so yeah, we've talked enough about twisted fruit that results from cutting down or cutting at certain roots, and there's more to talk about next week. And so we'll see you then.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Michael, for an excellent discussion.